You're squatting by the fire pit, and your stomach is already turning. Someone just handed you a bowl of warm milk, straight from an animal you don't fully trust yet. You know what happens next. Cramping, bloating, a gut that twists like it's fighting back. And yet the man across from you drinks it without a flinch. Same fire, same night, same species. So why does his body accept what yours violently rejects? This isn't a hypothetical. This happened, over and over, for thousands of years, to real people whose bodies were at war with a food that should have been harmless. Milk, the most basic nutrition on Earth. And for most of human history, adult bodies were built to reject it. Here's the part that should unsettle you. Every mammal on this planet is designed to drink milk as an infant and stop. Forever. The enzyme that breaks down lactose, the sugar in milk, shuts down after weaning in nearly every species alive. Humans were no exception. For hundreds of thousands of years, once a child stopped nursing, their bodies stopped producing the enzyme lactase. Drink milk as an adult, and you'd have paid for it with your gut. So when herding began, something strange happened. Humans started keeping animals that produced more milk than any wild prey ever could. Goats, sheep, cattle, a walking, breathing food source, standing right there in the pen, and their bodies couldn't use it. Imagine the cruelty of that. Surrounded by nutrition and unable to digest it. That's a scene you need to sit inside. Not a museum plaque, not a chart. A real person, staring at a source of food their own body, refused to accept. But here's what scientists actually found when they started digging into ancient bones, ancient teeth, and ancient DNA. The story wasn't just about failure. It was about a war inside the human body that some people were quietly winning, long before anyone understood why. Let's rewind further, because the setup matters. Around 10,000 years ago, humans in parts of the Near East and later Europe began domesticating animals for something other than meat. They wanted the milk, the wool, the labor, a slower, steadier form of survival compared to the boom and bust of hunting. This is often called the secondary products revolution. Instead of just killing the animal for its meat, humans started using it while it was alive. Milk became one of the most valuable things you could pull out of that arrangement. It didn't require killing anything. It replenished. A single cow or goat could feed a family for years, not just for one meal. In theory, this was the ultimate survival hack. A renewable resource standing on four legs. In practice, it was a trap for most of the population, because their guts weren't ready. Ask yourself something. What would you do if the smartest survival strategy available to your community was something your own body couldn't process? Would you force it down anyway? Would you find a workaround? Would you watch, resentfully, as someone else thrived on a thing that made you sick? This is where the story gets interesting, and this is roughly the point where everything you assumed about ancient humans drank milk needs to be reframed. Because most of them didn't. Not directly. Not as adults. Not without paying a physical price. Here's the reframe. For most of the time humans kept dairy animals, they weren't drinking milk the way you drink a glass of it today. They were transforming it into something their bodies could tolerate, fermenting it, souring it, turning it into yogurt and cheese and curds. Not because ancient people were foodies experimenting with flavor, because raw milk was making them sick and they had to outsmart their own biology to survive off the animals they'd already committed to keeping. Think about what that means. The invention of cheese wasn't a luxury. It was a medical workaround, discovered by trial, error, and probably a lot of stomach pain. When milk ferments, bacteria break down much of the lactose before it ever reaches your gut. Cheese, especially aged cheese, contains only a fraction of the lactose found in fresh milk. Early dairy farmers likely didn't understand the chemistry. They understood the outcome. Ferment it, and it stops hurting. Don't ferment it, and it doesn't. Archaeologists have found the proof baked directly into ancient pottery. Residue analysis on shards from sites in Poland, dating back roughly 7,000 years, revealed fat signatures consistent with cheesemaking. Strainers riddled with tiny holes, built specifically for separating curds from whey. That's not guesswork. That's engineering, built around a biological limitation most of the population still had. So picture the scene again, but now with new information. The person who can't digest raw milk isn't a failure. They're the majority. They're the normal case. An entire dairy economy around them had to be reshaped, fermented, and processed just to make it usable for most human bodies. But something else was happening at the same time, quietly, generation after generation. Somewhere in the gene pool, a mutation was spreading, a rare genetic change that kept the lactase enzyme switched on into adulthood. People with this mutation could drink raw milk their entire lives without the cramping, without the bloating, without the digestive punishment everyone else endured. This mutation is now called lactase persistence. And here's the piece that should genuinely disturb you. It didn't spread because it made people happier. It spread because it made them survive when others didn't. Picture two families in the same failing season. Crops thin, meat scarce, but the herd is still producing milk every single day. One family can drink it straight from the animal and absorb the calories, the fat, the hydration, without losing anything to digestive distress. The other family can only access it in small, fermented portions, losing time, losing yield, losing calories to the processing itself. In a famine, in a drought, in a brutal winter, that difference is a line between a child who survives and a child who doesn't. This is natural selection, not as an abstract textbook concept, but as a slow-motion filtering of who got to have children and who didn't. Every generation, slightly more people carried the mutation. Every generation, slightly fewer people needed to ferment their milk to survive off it. Here's a number that should stop you for A. Second, studies on ancient DNA suggest that as recently as roughly 5,000 years ago, in parts of Europe, lactase persistence was still rare, even among populations that were already deep into dairy farming. People were living inside a full-blown dairy economy, and the majority of them still couldn't drink the product without getting sick. That gap between we rely on this animal, and we can actually digest what it makes lasted for thousands of years. Thousands of years of bloated stomachs, forced tolerance, careful fermentation, and quiet suffering just to keep a food source alive that the body hadn't caught up to yet. Now here's where this connects to something inside you, right now, today. Roughly 65% of the global adult population is lactose intolerant to some degree. Not broken, not defective. That's actually the ancestral default setting for adult humans. The people who can drink a glass of milk without consequence are the genetic outliers, the descendants of a mutation that spread hard through specific populations, mostly in Northern Europe, parts of East Africa, and small pockets of the Middle East and South Asia. Sit with that for a second. If you can drink milk comfortably as an adult, you are, biologically speaking, carrying evidence of an ancient survival advantage baked directly into your DNA. If you can't, you're carrying the more common, more ancient human condition. Neither is a flaw. One is just newer than the other. This is where your own instincts should start to wobble a little. Because most people assume dairy tolerance is normal, and intolerance is the exception, the disorder, the thing that needs explaining. Scientifically, it's the opposite. Intolerance is the baseline. Tolerance is a mutation. Modern food culture just built an entire industry around the outlier trait and made everyone else feel abnormal for reacting exactly the way their ancestors' bodies were designed to. What you're about to hear was hidden from history books for a long time, buried underneath a much simpler, much cleaner story. The clean story goes like this. Humans domesticated animals, started drinking milk, and moved on. Simple, linear, comfortable. The real story is messier and far more brutal, because lactase persistence didn't spread evenly, and it didn't spread kindly. It tracked almost exactly with which populations survived certain famines, which populations expanded into which territories, and in some interpretations, which populations outcompeted others for land and resources during major migrations across ancient Europe. There's a theory, still debated among researchers, that the ability to digest milk didn't just help individuals survive. It may have given entire cultures a demographic edge. Groups with access to a stable, calorie-dense, protein-rich food source that didn't require killing the animal could support larger populations, recover faster from bad harvests, and expand their territory more aggressively than groups still tied to fermenting or avoiding dairy altogether. If that's true, then a random genetic mutation in someone's gut didn't just change what people ate. It may have quietly reshaped who ended up controlling which parts of ancient Europe. A trait as small as an enzyme staying switched on for a few extra decades of someone's life, compounding across thousands of years into population-level dominance. Does that make you uncomfortable? It should, because it means something as intimate and biological as your ability to digest a glass of milk might be tangled up in the deep, ugly machinery of ancient conquest and replacement. Not a war fought with weapons, a war fought with metabolism. Let's slow down and rebuild the human side of this, because it's easy to lose the individual person inside numbers like these. Picture a mother, roughly 6,000 years ago, somewhere in what's now Central Europe. Her herd is barely surviving a bad season. She has milk, but not much else. She has a toddler who's just been weaned, and an older child who's already showing signs of malnutrition. If that older child happens to carry the lactase persistence mutation, milk becomes an emergency food source. Not a treat, a lifeline. Direct calories, direct hydration, direct fat, without the labor and time loss of fermentation. If that child doesn't carry the mutation, that same bowl of milk becomes a gamble. Nutrition on one side, diarrhea and dehydration on the other. In a body that's already weakened and can't afford to lose more fluid or more nutrients to a bad reaction. In a stable year, that difference might not matter much. In a famine year, it could be the entire difference between a child who lives to have children of their own and one who doesn't. That's not an abstract statistic. That's a single household, a single hard winter, a single roll of the genetic dice deciding who got a metabolic advantage no one in that family understood or asked for. This is also where psychology bleeds into your modern life, whether you notice it or not. Humans carry a deep, ancient wiring around food safety, and dairy sits right at the center of it. Ever notice how disgust around spoiled milk feels almost more intense than disgust around other spoiled foods? That's not random. Milk spoils fast, and historically, drinking bad milk could mean serious illness in populations already struggling with digestion. The disgust response tied to sour, off-smelling dairy is likely an ancient survival mechanism, still fully wired into your brain today, protecting you from a threat your ancestors faced constantly. Here's another modern echo. Ever wonder why lactose intolerance still carries a strange kind of social stigma in some cultures, treated almost like a personal failing instead of completely normal biological variation? That stigma likely traces back to how deeply dairy became tied to status, wealth, and cultural identity in populations where lactase persistence became common. If your community built its entire food economy and self-image around dairy, then not being able to tolerate it wasn't just inconvenient. It marked you as different in a culture that had quietly forgotten intolerance used to be the norm for almost everyone, everywhere. And here's a third connection, maybe the most unsettling one. Modern humans still instinctively associate certain foods with strength, virility, and social power, often without any real nutritional logic. Behind it, milk is one of the clearest examples. Drink your milk, grow big and strong, is a phrase most people heard as children in cultures descended from lactase-persistent populations. That phrase isn't nutritional advice. It's a cultural fossil, an inherited belief system built on top of a genetic advantage that most humans on Earth never actually had. Let's push further into the darker layer now, because this is where the story stops being about biology and starts being about survival politics. Some researchers studying ancient migration patterns have proposed something genuinely disturbing. In regions where lactase persistence became common, dairying populations may have expanded not just because they had better nutrition, but because that nutrition let them recover from crises faster than neighboring groups who couldn't fully exploit their herds. Faster recovery means faster population growth. Faster population growth, over generations, can mean territorial expansion, competition for land, and in some cases, the slow displacement or absorption of neighboring groups who didn't carry the same genetic advantage. This is part of a broader, heavily debated theory around how certain ancient populations, particularly steppe herders migrating into Europe thousands of years ago, may have outcompeted earlier farming populations, partially through advantages tied to animal husbandry and dairy. Ancient DNA studies have shown massive population turnover in parts of Europe during these migration waves, with incoming groups contributing a significant share of ancestry to modern Europeans in a relatively short window of time. No single trait explains a shift that massive, Disease, mobility, weaponry, and culture all played roles. But the ability to convert a herd of animals into a stable, reliable, high-calorie food source without needing to constantly process or ferment it may have been one quiet thread running underneath the whole thing, a digestive enzyme, invisible, untouchable, deciding in the background who got to outsurvive who. That's the darkest reveal buried inside a story about milk. It's not really about milk at all. It's about how something as small and internal as an enzyme staying active a few extra decades of someone's life could ripple outward into famine survival, population growth, territorial expansion, and possibly the slow disappearance of entire cultural groups who simply didn't carry that one genetic switch. Think about how strange that is. No one chose this. No ancient person sat down and decided their descendants would outsurvive their neighbors because of mutation in a single gene. It happened silently, invisibly, over thousands of years, hidden inside people's guts, showing up only as who got sick after dinner and who didn't. And this pattern didn't just happen once. In parts of East Africa, a completely separate lactase persistence mutation evolved independently among cattle-herding populations who depended heavily on milk for survival in harsh, arid environments. Different gene, different location, same underlying pressure. Wherever humans built their survival strategy around milk, evolution eventually found a way to reward the bodies that could use it best. This is called convergent evolution, and it's one of the clearest signs in all of human genetics that this pressure was real, brutal, and repeated. It wasn't a one-time fluke in one lucky population. It was nature independently arriving at the same brutal solution in multiple places because the survival stakes around milk were consistently dangerously high. Now bring this back to your own body, sitting wherever you're sitting right now. If you can drink a glass of milk without a second thought, you are living proof of a filtering process that took thousands of years and countless quiet deaths to produce. If you can't, and your stomach turns the moment dairy hits it, you're not malfunctioning. You're experiencing the default human condition, the same one nearly every ancient human adult on Earth lived with for almost the entire span of our species' existence. There's something almost humbling in that. An entire modern industry, built around cheese aisles, milk cartons, ice cream, lattes, treats an ancient biological rarity as if it were the universal human norm. And every time someone winces after a glass of milk, their body is quietly reenacting a struggle that shaped migrations, famines, and possibly the rise and fall of ancient populations thousands of years before dairy farms or supermarkets ever existed. So here's the final thought to sit with, long after this video ends. The next time you see someone pass on the cheese platter or reach for oat milk instead of dairy, you're not watching a modern food preference. You're watching one of the oldest biological divides in human history play out in real time, at a dinner table, without anyone in the room realizing it. Ancient humans spent thousands of years fermenting, straining, and reshaping milk just to survive off an animal their bodies weren't built to exploit. Some of their descendants eventually won that internal war. Most of us are still fighting it, one uncomfortable glass at a time.